Okay, I think it started now.
Sounds good. And we'll see if I can share. Correct slide. And share. Okay, are you seeing that?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So thanks everybody.
Graham,
Okay.
so first I would like to introduce you to everyone.
Okay. Sounds good.
I will take a minute.
It's
Okay,
all
so
good.
thank you everyone for joining, and we are really thankful to Graham for his time and giving us an overview of the literature review thing. We will go from here, and I want to introduce him. He started as an environmental social scientist. His research explores a wide range of questions at the intersection of people, the environment, and policy. Specifically, his research investigates how environmental policies influence behavior and sustainability outcomes in different contexts using both qualitative and quantitative method, and seeks to uncover the context in which particular policies are likely to increase prospects for sustainability. He completed his undergraduate degree in ecology at the University of Waterloo, and then he did his master's in international rural planning and development at the University of Guelph, and he did his PhD from Indiana University. His research has been published in a number of different venues, including the International Journal of the Commons, Ecology and Society, and Current Opinion in Environmental Sustainability. So as you can see, he has a lot of experience from these areas, and will definitely be benefited from his talk today. So and also I would like to thank Maria today for mediating this conversation and convincing Graham for this presentation. Yeah, Maria, go ahead, please.
Yes, no, I just wanted to say again, thank you so much, Graham, for being here, and to all the other students that this is going to be highly beneficial for all of us. Literature reviews are becoming more and more popular, and for anybody who is in graduate school is going to be an avenue that I highly encourage everybody to explore. So yeah, thank you so much again, Graham.
Okay, Graham, over to you.
Yeah, not a problem. And so also, I mean, I love conversational type, and I know it's hard over Teams and Zooms, but if you have a question, something you want to deal with right away, just, whatever, raise your hand, speak up, because I'd rather deal with them while I'm going through. So yes, I was asked to provide kind of a brief overview of the various ways in which literature reviews are used in sustainability research, whatever this kind of broad amorphous field that we all find ourselves working in, whether it's social culture systems, sustainability research, and so on. Increasingly, literature reviews are, and how we do literature reviews are being critiqued and analyzed, and so it's good to know, to be aware of where things are going and some of the opportunities you can have to productively use a literature review for your research. So as an overview today, I'm going to provide an overview of how literature reviews can be advanced to advance research on sustainability. And as you're going to find out, I'm really focusing on the emerging field of evidence synthesis. So things like systematic reviews, systematic maps, or scoping reviews. This doesn't necessarily mean that you always have to adopt all these approaches, because literature reviews can serve multiple purposes, but you might consider adopting some of these best practices or ideas in other types of general literature review. So if it's part of a big project where you've done field research, maybe you want to consider adopting one or two elements of an evidence synthesis project to improve the literature review that informs your research. So, but by the end of this session, you should be able to identify and describe different types of literature review options, understand the various ways in which a review is undertaken and for what purposes different approaches serve, and I understand the stages of a literature review and options for improving the literature review, or even just understanding the variety of different options that exist for when I'm searching for studies? What are some of the best practices that research has identified for dealing with this? Most of this is going to be at a high level. But again, please, if you have a question, just yeah, raise your hand or speak up and we can discuss it with the group. So I'm going to talk about the different types of literature reviews. And generally speaking, I would say that there are at least 5 major classes of literature reviews. This doesn't necessarily mean that everyone will agree that these are the 5 types of literature reviews that exist, but I think it does a pretty good job of differentiating between different types of reviews that are undertaken. First of which is the more classic literature or narrative review, someone basically describing the state of a particular field, why they're doing the research they're doing. Another type of review that begins to incorporate some systematic aspects is what is known by a scoping review by some or a systematic map by others. There are also rapid reviews where people take a few shortcuts in order to complete a review, because as you're going to find out as we go through this talk, is being systematic immediately implies lots of time, a significant investment of time and resources, and sometimes those are just not possible. And so we need to have opportunities to take some shortcuts. The systematic review is probably the core type of review that is understood, and we're increasingly being confronted by systematic reviews in the literature, and this is where they're trying to make sense of the effects of a particular type of intervention or exposure for a group. And statistical meta-analysis is a particular subclass of systematic reviews where the studies rely upon statistical methods to pool results and look at an overall impact across larger populations. And lastly, if you happen to work in a field where a lot of systematic reviews have been done, an umbrella review is something that's used to integrate insights across multiple systematic reviews. And so this is becoming more common for sure in the medical sciences, less so, but I have been involved in well, even I've had some exposure in the past to other projects where synthesis of reviews are used as a way to, again, deal with this so much information problem. So I'm going to provide a brief overview of what each of these types of reviews are, how they're used, and again, yeah, feel free to ask any questions. So literature review is generally what we think of when we think of or narrative review is generally what we think of when we think of a literature review. And this is basically trying to make sense of a literature, usually to inform the development of a research project. You'll do a case study on community-based fisheries management or so on. And then you provide some of the background of, hey, why are we doing this work? What are the research questions, or what are the gaps that are being addressed by your research? And so this is, generally speaking, what we think of in terms of a literature review. Oftentimes, the search for a narrative review is not comprehensive. Oftentimes, systematic protocols are not adhered to when we talk about a traditional narrative review. So defining features of a narrative review are defined to a great extent by the absence of a systematic process for review in the literature. So you will not see a flow chart of the various decisions that the reviewers and the authors made as part of the research. Instead, they won't have great details about how they identified studies, how they screened studies, and then how they coded and made sense of this. But literature reviews are used or narrative reviews are used to address a wide range of research questions, and they can be really good for configurative research where you're trying to make sense of some phenomena or some literature. We all have brains, and we're able to process information. And so although there is pressure to be more systematic, at times adopting systematic protocols will slow you down and neglect the fact that you, with your own brain, your own learning, your past experiences, can really help to identify useful research to make sense of what it is. So a good example of this from some work that I have really enjoyed reading, and it was a great paper, was a study looking at the mechanisms that states use to retain or gain control over forest resources in the context of decentralization. So this was written by Jesse Rabeau and Arun Agrawal in 2006. And it was a really, really great paper uncovering mechanisms by simply choosing to perform 3 case studies or synthesize literature on 3 case studies of forest decentralization. So the big point I want you to get from a literature or narrative review is, although they are not systematic and some reviewers might frown upon them, is that there is really great potential value from adopting a classic literature review approach. So when should you consider to using a literature or narrative review? Well, first, if your goal is to develop or refine hypotheses, again, you're going to read some literature to try and make sense of it and to develop ideas for another research, for primary research. This is a great use of time for a literature or narrative review. Another time you might want to use it is when time and resources are limited. Oftentimes, if you're working in your PhD, you do not have 2 years to do a really detailed systematic review on a phenomena, and you also don't have any resources to hire additional people to help you out with your work. And so in these cases, it's probably wise to at least consider performing a more traditional literature or narrative review. Another example that I've already alluded to is when it's part of a larger research project. Lastly, a literature or narrative review might be used when there are lower stakes involved, if you are not trying to directly inform policymakers with the results of your individual study, and if you're willing to accept some risks associated with diverse and sometimes unknown sources of bias. So the primary weakness of doing a literature or narrative review is that I fundamentally don't know, and I have limited opportunity to develop an understanding of what your personal biases were that led to your process of identifying articles, screening, and saying, hey, this one belongs and this one doesn't. And if I don't have that understanding, then it's hard for me as an external reviewer to understand the quality of the underlying evidence. And that's why there is this push for more systematic protocols. At least it provides me an insight into your thinking so I can understand some potential biases that might exist. And Hadaway, who's a big proponent of systematic reviews, also suggests that although it might not be possible in your individual study to adopt all the principles of a systematic review in a narrative review, you could still incorporate some aspects to address some potential sources of bias and maybe help to alleviate some concerns. So I'm going to move on, jump over rapid reviews, and we are going to come back to them, but it kind of makes sense to come back to them after we talk about what a scoping review or a systematic map is. And so first of all, you will find that these scoping reviews or systematic maps, there's 2 terms used for them. So if you were dealing with authors doing a PRISMA study, they'll tend to talk about a scoping review, whereas those adhering to the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence guidance will refer to them as a systematic map. For the most part, and to my understanding, they are completely the same. There might be a few idiosyncratic differences across the two, but either term is appropriate. And generally speaking, a systematic map is an overview of the distribution and abundance of evidence in relation to a pretty broad question of policy or management relevance. And they tend to be configurative. That is, again, they're a sense-making exercise. What are the topic and trends in the literature on the commons? What are the themes investigated by research on small-scale fisheries? That's configurative. It's trying to say, it's asking this very broad question, saying, what can I make sense of this? But when compared to a literature or classic literature and a narrative review, they do adhere to more systematic protocols as they go through the process. So defining features of a scoping review or systematic map are the use of systematic protocols for searching, screening, sometimes appraising. You don't actually have to do this all the time with a scoping review, but you might want to appraise, study, and perform a synthesis. Once again, they differ from narrative reviews in their adherence to fixed protocols, and they differ from systematic reviews in generally speaking, is that they're not aiming to test hypotheses. Rather, they're interested in forming ideas, forming hypotheses, and so on. So systematic maps can be used to address a range of different research questions, develop hypotheses, inform future research. One of the reasons they are often used is to help identify, is as a first step for a systematic review to say, hey, are there enough studies available for me even to think about doing a systematic review? And people use a systematic map that pursues a few different objectives alongside understanding how much evidence is available. And one example of a systematic map, I think, that was trying to serve this purpose was by Brooks et al. In 2020, who looked at the extent and occurrence of articles examining the effects of conservation interventions on social and ecological outcomes within tropical coral reefs, mangroves, and seagrass ecosystems. So they're trying to understand, what are the effects of conservation interventions, but first, how much evidence is available? And I was actually 2 weeks ago at a workshop with one of the participants in this project, and just hopefully to make you feel a little bit at ease, they include a lot of really, really excellent researchers who've been working for 10 plus years, and they are really struggling to adhere to the protocols they've developed. There have been a lot of challenges along the way, and this is a recurrent theme in systematic reviews and scoping reviews, is that that while being systematic has its advantages for addressing potential sources of biases, it creates challenges that tend to prolong research projects. So when should you consider using a scoping review or systematic map? First, to identify the types of available evidence in a given field. That again is, hey, is there even enough evidence for me to do a systematic review? How much is out there on this topic? To clarify key concepts or definitions in the literature. So if you are working in small scale fisheries, you want to understand, how are people talking about small scale fisheries? I've been working on a collaborative research project through the lens of blue justice, and we're trying to understand, so what is blue justice? What are the varying ways in which it's conceived of in the literature, and where did it come from, and how does it relate to other research traditions? That's a great use of a scoping review or systematic map. To examine how research is conducted on a certain topic or field. Perhaps you're interested in how different methods are used to examine a topic, what types of control variables people are using in studies, and so on. To identify key characteristics or factors related to a concept, perhaps what are the drivers affecting collective action in small-scale fisheries? What are the factors driving environmental degradation? Before you want to perform a systematic review, you might want to have a sense of some of the variables you might want to include, and this is one way you could do it. And obviously, this has kind of been a recurring theme through these different reasons for doing it, is as a precursor to a systematic review. And obviously, identify and analyze knowledge gaps. So now I'm going to move on to provide a brief overview of systematic reviews, what they are, and how they are used. And generally speaking, a systematic review is a review of evidence relative to a pretty clearly formulated research question, essentially a test of a hypothesis. And by using you use systematic protocols to identify, select, critically appraise, and analyze data to make inferences about the effects of some intervention or the effects of exposure to some condition. And so systematic reviews are generally defined by research questions that have clearly defined populations, interventions, topics, and conditions of interest. Now, when you look at the literature, you're going to see a lot of systematic reviews that are not engaged in hypothesis testing. And that isn't necessarily a problem. The problem arises when you speak to certain audiences. So one of the audiences that a lot of systematic reviews and systematic maps are trying to speak now is to readers of the Environmental Evidence Journal. And the Environment Evidence Journal would not suggest that a systematic review is used to make sense of a particular topic or theme. And instead, that would be a systematic map. So when we use these terms, systematic review, systematic map, scoping review, we need to speak the language of our audiences. And so if you are speaking to the Environmental Evidence Journal, then you would not be using the term systematic review to refer to a sense-making research project. But other audiences have broader definitions of what a systematic review or scoping map or a scoping review is, and you can use different language as you see fit. It's just important to consider the audiences that we're speaking to. So according to the Environmental Evidence Journal's definitions, a systematic review would generally include one or more hypotheses. Systematic reviews follow predefined protocols through all stages of the evidence synthesis or literature review process, including providing details about how studies are identified and included in a study, how you screen to say, we're going to include this or exclude this study from analysis. Importantly, they require some type of critical appraisal to say, this study is high quality by certain standards and should be included in my review versus other studies that are lower quality and might be excluded, and also details about the methods that will be used to synthesize evidence. Importantly, systematic review protocols or scoping review protocols don't necessarily have to provide the final word. You don't have to necessarily have your final coding protocol available at the time you submit your protocols, but you do need to describe how you are going to develop and adapt your protocols, the processes that are going to be used. So perhaps you might develop a protocol for coding a research instrument and describe how you are going to test it, refine it, and then ultimately make a decision when, hey, this protocol is good enough to be used. It is also possible to make some changes to protocols after they've been submitted, but these need to be reported as part of your final submission of your systematic review or your scoping review. Systematic reviews can be used to address a wide range of research questions, again, that adhere to these criteria, and generally speaking, to the effects of an intervention. So someone has made some change in the system, a major policy change or so on, or exposure to some condition. So perhaps you could look at the effects of the effects of different adaptive capacity supporting programs after exposure to a hazard such as a flood or a hurricane or so on. The example from the Environmental Evidence Journal that I'm drawing upon is looking at the outcomes of marine site protection on poverty. So what happens when we create a marine protected area and with respect to the poverty of nearby and adjacent communities? So when should you consider using a systematic review? Well, first, if your research question is focused with a relatively clearly defined hypothesis, again, there's some room within a systematic review to adapt hypotheses as long as you describe them ahead of time. And which includes details, though these hypotheses need to include details about the population you're interested in studying, the types of interventions or exposures that are going to be analyzed, and the different conditions of interest that might define whether they are going to be analyzed or not. When you have the number of studies available is sufficiently large, and that's one of the reasons why you might start off with a systematic map, is to first find out, are there enough studies for me to even consider performing this type of analysis? And most importantly, if you have adequate time and resources in order to undertake this systematic review. At a minimum, some guidance suggests that you should have at a minimum 12 to 18 months in order to complete a good systematic review. And in many cases, this is just not possible for your research. So if you want to do the best job, I would plan for a minimum 12 to 18 months for a great systematic review, but it could stretch on beyond that. And if you don't have those resources, perhaps consider using an alternative approach. And one of the alternative approaches you might want to consider using is a rapid review. And a rapid review is pretty much a systematic map or systematic review with shortcuts. So they do follow clearly defined and transparent protocols, but they don't follow, but they take either shortcuts or they don't follow the gold standard approaches in order to limit the time and resources that are required in order to complete a review. So one of the things they might do is have one reviewer performing screening and data coding. And this is something that you'll often do as part of your PhD, is you won't have access to a second person. The Environmental Evidence Journal requires a second spot checker at a minimum in order to have systematic reviews published in the Environmental Evidence Journal. Other things you might do is just review abstracts. I was part of a study where we used natural language processing to look at a whole bunch of different abstracts to reveal topics and trends. Again, that is somewhat limiting. At the same time, it provided an opportunity to get some high-level insights. You might consider fewer databases to be included in your search. Or if you identify 10,000 papers, you identify a lot of papers, and you just simply won't have the time in order to screen uh, to screen all those studies or to code all those studies, you could draw a random or a systematic random sample of those sources to make it more feasible. You could also develop stopping rules based on saturation, and we know that this is often used in qualitative research. If you are doing a bunch of interviews and the number of topics that each interview starts adding is starting to plateau, people are telling you the same things you've been heard before, people will stop conducting interviews. The same type of thing can be done in a rapid review. If you're trying to identify topics and themes, you're reading more, you're not really getting more value or more insights, you can develop a stopping rule as part of a rapid review. So when do you use this? When do you want to use a rapid review? Well, in cases where information is urgently needed for decision making. So a great example of this from not too long ago in our past, people really want to know, do masks work? Do they help deal with transmission of COVID-19? There wasn't time for people to 18 to 24 months to do the best systematic review. Rather, they had to do a rapid review and pick studies out that they thought could inform it and allow rapid decision making. Again, limited time and resources. You don't have anyone to help you with screening and coding. Rapid review might help you to make that more feasible. In practice, I would suggest that most, if not all, systematic maps and reviews incorporate shortcuts to limit the number of included studies. And so there is a little bit of a fuzzy boundary between them. And whether you decide to call it a rapid review or not is in part up to you, because most studies are doing something to make it more feasible. We know that the literatures are growing rapidly, and the types of search terms that you are going, like the searches that you're going to do, small scale fisheries, might return thousands and thousands of records, and it's only growing. So it's just important to note that a lot of people are taking shortcuts. Anytime you start off with 2,000 and you end up with fewer than 100, I think it's good to be skeptical. If the reviewer or the author is claiming that they took no shortcuts in their work. And lastly, as a brief introduction to umbrella reviews, it is a review of reviews and can be one way that you can deal with a large body of evidence that people are increasingly producing literature reviews and systematic maps. And if we could probably do a pretty good job of synthesizing a literature by synthesizing the syntheses and helping to make sense. So umbrella reviews only include review articles. And again, there are debates about what this means. Does this mean only systematic reviews and systematic maps, or do we have a broader definition that incorporates other types of literature or narrative reviews? I would suggest in the fields that we're working in, small-scale fisheries, sustainability, environmental governance, that including general literature reviews would probably be wise. And the general aim of this is to assess whether evidence is consistent across these different types of reviews, if it's contradictory, and if it is contradictory, to explore potential explanations for why the evidence isn't aligning. Perhaps people are looking at different types of populations. Perhaps people are using different methods, and so generating different types of research finding. When should you use an umbrella review? Well, if you have a sufficient number of reviews are available, and second, if time and resources are limited. Basically, this is another type of rapid review. Okay, before I move on, I just want to see if there's any questions about generally, what the different options are, and so on. And also take a break to have a little coffee. But yes, let me know if there's any questions.
Yeah, please, anyone, if you have any question, go ahead, or you can write in the chat box as well.
Okay.
I have one very fast question. Is it okay if I ask?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much, Graham. It is very informative. So, okay. So in one of the initial slides, you mentioned about the possibility of including bias in literature review, because there is a vast majority of literatures that we have to include, and the time is so limited for researchers. So, and you mentioned that it's possible to adapt aspects of a narrative review to address some types of bias. I think the researcher was Hedabay. So, can you please just explain what this narrative review means there? Just
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of literature review, I think the literature narrative review, this is where it gets so confusing because they're all literature reviews, so I'll use narrative review. Is generally, the classic approach where you and your advisors are experts on a particular topic, whether it's small scale fisheries, and you just do your search and you pull stuff up and you have a folder somewhere, like on your computer, and this is your small scale fishery stuff. You pick this and then you do make sense, like you're making sense of it, but you're not describing like how did you come about having this folder that's full of material? How did you say, this is good and will help me, and this will not? Like implicitly, you did a search, some things have popped up on your screen, and you decide I'm going to save some things, and other things I'm going to throw out. That's not necessarily bad or wrong. It's just that I don't know, as an external person, I don't know what went into your mind to say, why did I keep this in and why did I keep that out? And then when you go to do your literature review, it's incorporating both what you found from these studies, but it doesn't tell me, is this really the literature on, or not, is this really? That has a problematic assumption. But what are your, what is it about you that guided the selection of studies and might lead in a certain direction? And some of the biases I think that tend to happen is like methods based. We all have certain methods that we like to read, or certain types of studies that we enjoy. Like I know myself, I'm so geared towards quantitative research, and sometimes I get bogged down by case studies. That like it's a lot of text and it creates challenges. So I think my personal bias would be to limit the case studies and and draw upon evidence from quantitative research. And so if I don't make my audience aware of some of these biases, then there's some challenges there. And so there are different ways you could do it. Is you could describe, identify your search terms that you use. Maybe you've got some studies and describe how you screen things out. Another way is just be implicit about our biases. That's hard. I'd both say like I would love if we could all do that, but I'd be worried about advising a student working with me trying to publish a study whether they should really do that.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much. So it means like you're taking yourself out of research and you're saying I can be also biased, but this is what criteria that I'm taking into consideration for selecting these kinds of like literature. I got it. Okay, it was very helpful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I do think it's generally like it both at the high level there is this abstract goal of trying to eliminate bias, but I think it's also implicitly we accept and recognize that we're not eliminating bias. It's about making it more explicit
Absolutely.
about what our source of biases are.
Yeah.
Okay, that's
Thank
great. Thank you.
Graham, I have a small question for you. Sorry.
Yeah.
So far my understanding is that systematic literature review will take at least 8 to 12 months or 10 months to do a really good systematic literature review. And for us, for the PhD students, we can go for the rapid one. I mean, rapid review. So there are students as well, master students. They get even shorter time for their
Yeah.
literature review. So which one would you recommend for them?
Yeah, I think a rapid review and to start off the process of just thinking about what's reasonable, like for both what you're trying to do, and then you know what's available to keep yourself sane, because like doing a real systematic review that aims to be the gold standard, doing the gold standard systematic review, I don't think is feasible for most PhD research projects. Maybe some, if that is the core focus, but if it's one of three, I don't think it's feasible. So now you move it down to a master's student. I don't even think it should start there, unless it's a big collaboration where that one master's student has, supervised by a professor, where a student has one piece of it, and then there's other pieces that they can draw upon later. And so for a master's student, yes, it would be to think early on and brainstorm with advisors and things like that about what are the appropriate shortcuts to take to ensure that this is manageable and to think our way through them as much as we can ahead of time. Because so often what happens, and I've both done this myself and recently had some students come to me looking for advice, is that we don't plan for these problems and they happen inevitably. And then we have to find some strategy to deal with it. So one that came to me recently was they wanted to add a few criteria to screening. One person had screened all the articles, and now the broader systematic review team wanted to add additional criteria to screening, and this was thousands of papers, and the person was just thinking, like, I can't go back and rescreen them all. So we thought about, okay, have the second screener screen for only these other factors. But the more we can think ahead of time of some of these problems, we can save ourselves a lot of worry, and get to the point where we are analyzing data a lot quicker. Yes, that would be my general guidance.
Yeah, thank you, Graham. Yeah, I also believe that this is a helpful advice that we should be in talk, or we should be in touch with our instructor or supervisor so that we know what are their expectation and what type of literature review they want, what they want actually from us. Because for master students, we don't have a lot of time.
No.
So yeah. So thank
No,
you.
and you,
Thank you for
yeah,
reflecting on this.
sounds good. And it might end up just chatting is better because we're dealing with real problems. If I don't finish today, I'm happy to both. I'll share the presentation, and then happy to come back later if we don't get through everything.
Yeah, sure.
So basically, a literature review, or regardless of the approach, really unfolds over 5 stages. And what a systematic protocol, systematic maps, or systematic reviews is make these a little bit more explicit. And these stages are searching, screening, critical appraisal, data extraction, and synthesis. And the important thing to note is that the decisions that we make at each of the stages of these processes can influence the results or the evidence that we generate from our literature review. So searching generally refers to the methods you use to identify potential studies for a literature review, and may involve the following things. a list of databases or websites that you use to identify studies. So systematic review, the unit or most literature reviews, the unit of analysis of studies, and you identify these studies through searching. I mean, in Google Scholar, you'll find out later it's usually not recommended Google Scholar, but it's also perfectly acceptable, or some type of website where you've identified potential studies from. A set of search strings or terms that you use to pull out studies. So you'll talk about small scale fisheries. You might have a geographic focus of small scale fisheries in South America or Africa or so on, but you use these strings to identify a population of studies for your analysis. Or you could describe the process by which you will develop and refine search strings. That usually it's a pretty good idea not to just have one search string that you start off with, but rather develop it over time, both for theoretical purposes, but also for practical purposes. Is that I'm doing one on water governance, and I included the term water management, and it had 10,000 studies. I couldn't do that. Although it'd be nice to have studies that use the term water management, it was way too many for the time and resources we had available, and so I had to include just the term water governance. Also, you generally want to have, or at least consider including, methods for identifying other studies that will not be identified through academic databases. So this is basically a gray, identifying sources from gray literatures, and you can use surveys or interviews of key stakeholders in order to do this. But there are growing calls for systematic reviews and scoping reviews to include gray literature because of the biases present in only looking at academic studies. So search strings can be developed and trialed in a variety of different ways, but a few frameworks have been developed to help think about the types of terms or the way I should construct my search strings. And they generally involve combining different combinations of your population of interest. If you are doing a systematic review where you're looking at intervention or exposure, you'll have a set of terms that relate to that intervention or exposure, a set of terms that relate to comparison conditions, as well as outcomes. So, for instance, if you're looking at poverty in the context of marine protected areas in sub-Saharan Africa, you would have sub-Saharan Africa as a part of your population, intervention, marine protected areas, and outcomes, well-being or poverty, or so on. And generally speaking, you would use the Boolean search operator and to join terms to capture synonyms for different interventions. So you could say marine protected area or ORs to join things within these. So marine protected area or marine reserve as your interventions, and then the Boolean operator and to join populations to interventions, comparisons, and outcomes. Another framework that's used is the population concept and context. And again, that's where you'd identify a population you're interested in examining, some concept like small scale fisheries, and the context in which they're found. So some best practices for developing searches of the literature are to, and this isn't necessarily just Scopus or Web of Science, but this paper up here by Gusenbauer and Hadaway evaluated 26, I guess it was 28 different academic databases and on a variety of criteria for using them in systematic reviews or scoping reviews. And they found that Scopus and Web of Science generally had desirable properties, while Google Scholar did not. Now, if you have started your research and you have used Google Scholar, do not worry. Very many systematic reviews and scoping reviews are using Google Scholar. But if you are starting out, on the other hand, consider shifting to Scopus and Web of Science as your primary sources. And then if you still need to identify or want to identify additional resources, then consider using Google Scholar as a supplementary resource, which is what that paper recommends. To the extent possible, if you are looking to evaluate the effects of some intervention or exposure, incorporation of gray literature is a good idea to address biases associated with publication. And one of these is that we know we're more likely to publish studies with statistically significant results. And so thus it's quite possible that you are missing a lot of studies with null results. They found out that participation has no impact on well-being or conservation or small-scale fisheries and so on. Those studies might be more likely to be found in gray literature. More sources are generally better than fewer. So yes, the study that identifies 10,000 sources the search term that identifies 10,000 will generally be better, produce stronger evidence with respect to a particular phenomenon, but there are usually diminishing returns. And of course, you need to think about your time and resources available. What you'll tend to see in terms of the guidance that is provided for doing systematic reviews or scoping reviews is the gold standard approach, as I've already mentioned. But these are not always feasible for you in your research. Now we're going to move on to screening, and I might end here depending on how far we get, but I actually don't have that much left, so I might just try and move a little bit quicker. Screening generally refers to the methods that are used to identify studies to be synthesized in an evidence synthesis project or a literature review. And when you're providing details about what you're screening, how you are screening studies, you want to provide details about the number of stages to be used in screening. So it's very, very common to have a first stage screening looking only at title and abstracts, and a second stage screening looking at full text. But it's completely possible to do just a title screening if you have a lot of search, if you're returning a lot of articles. The methods that you are going to use to screen studies. Are you going to have one coder or two coders? How are you going to resolve disagreements when they occur? The criteria that you are going to use to include and exclude studies. So again, if you are looking at small scale fisheries in South America, well, you would one of your inclusion criteria would be, hey, large scale commercial fisheries, or studies that are located outside of South America. As well, and lastly, the methods that you use in order to assess consistency if you have more than one coders. We want to get a sense of, if you have two coders doing this, to what extent are they coding the same things? And thus, could we expect, if we brought on a third coder, or if I came in as an external reviewer, to what extent might I expect that I would generate a similar set of studies as part of my screening process? As I've already mentioned, screening can unfold over one or multiple stages, but in practice, the most common approach is this two-stage process: title and abstract, and full-text screening. Studies are screened explicitly or implicitly on a range of criteria, but oftentimes the criteria will relate to one or more of the research questions. So do they align with your PICO or your population concept context criteria that you used in your search string? Certain research methods, you might want to give preference to certain types of research methods. So a lot of people trying to perform a systematic review only include randomized control trials and will systematically exclude observational studies from their analysis, as well as some practical considerations resulting from your team. So you might choose to exclude certain languages because you don't have anybody that can read it. Another thing that's often done is limiting the publication date. That's usually to make it more the time period under study, not the publication date, but only look at case studies that are looking at relatively recent phenomena rather than looking back at the 1700s in feudal Japan. That might not be as relevant for the study we're working on now. A variety of automated, semi-automated, or manual processes can be used for screening. And so if you have a lot of studies, it's probably not possible for you to read 10,000 abstracts in a reasonable time frame. And so one of the things that are done is people will develop an additional list of keywords beyond that list that they used for searching to include or exclude studies that have one or more of these keywords. You might consider using natural language processing. So one of the tools that's available is Rayan, and there you can train a model to screen. It will essentially, you provide information about this should be in and this should be out, and it uses that information along with text from the abstract to screen studies in and out of a study. So it helps you to do that. You could also simply divide amongst multiple screeners. Some of the best practices for screening include incorporating fewer screening criteria, which tends to facilitate more consistent screening. We all know we're human beings. We have cognitive limitations. I'm going to do a much better job of screening if I'm considering 5 factors than if I'm trying to consider 50 or 25. My brain simply cannot process 25 factors at the same time, and so try to limit to a more feasible set. 2 coders is generally desirable by at least for at least some studies and required by some standards. So again, the Environmental Evidence Journal will require that you at least have a second coder do some spot checks of your work to see and provide some measure of consistency. If you do have 2 coders, though, you need to have mechanisms for resolving disagreements, because there's pretty much 100% chance that you're not always going to agree with the other coder. Also, if the number of studies is large, considering automated screening shortcuts using keywords or algorithms may be helpful, just to make this more feasible for you to complete. I'm going to jump ahead to some of these, and just talk about some of the best practices. So one of the things that differentiates systematic reviews from systematic maps or other types of literature reviews is the use of some mechanism to critically appraise studies so that we're not always taking evidence at face value. Some evidence is better than others, or at least if you adopt certain standards for research, that there are certain methodological standards to qualitative research methods, to quantitative research methods that tell us this is a better or a worse study. And so what systematic reviews ask us to do is to critically appraise this, to group studies into high quality, medium quality, low quality, and so on. And that it is a best practice to develop tools to critically appraise the studies that are going to inform the evidence that we produce from our research. The big problem here is that the tools that are readily available, the off-the-shelf tools, are heavily dominated by the medical sciences and within our own field by environmental scientists. And it's not easy to just take them off the shelf and apply them to our own studies. So there has to be some steps taken in order to develop these on an individual research basis. And the other thing to note is that they are not required for systematic maps. But as a general practice, it's just really good. Don't take all evidence at face value, because some evidence is better than others. And we need to be considering that more and more as we are undertaking our research. And lastly, I'm going to jump through this, and I'm happy to talk about it. And I can stay after, but I know some of you will be leaving at 12. And feel free. I will not be offended. I'll talk about some best practices for data extraction. And so data extraction is basically referring to the process by which, hey, we've got through all this, we've got our studies, we've screened them, and now we're going to pull out information from these studies to either make sense of some field, develop hypotheses, characterize the scope and quantity of available evidence. But we need to have tools to pull that data out so we can compare it. And so this is really, really hard, just like screening. It can be really, really hard, and there's a lot of challenges that can come up. And some of the best things we can do in order to confront those challenges, yet while trying to still be systematic, is to develop processes for, hey, we're going to develop a code book, but accept that, on your first try, the chances that you're going to have the perfect code book are really, really low. And to plan for mechanisms to test and refine that code book. And this doesn't have to be the same method that's used over and over again. It can be an iterative process. So perhaps your first process, we're going to co-develop this with stakeholders, and then we're going to work together and sit together in a room and try and code 10 studies, and then we're going to refine the code book. And then after that first initial stage, now we're going to code 10 papers independently. And then we're going to assess how high our level of agreement is. If it's good, we're going to then code our studies independently. But if it's not, then we'll continue to refine our code book over time. We will resolve the disagreement. So we're going to include that the 10 studies we did together, and then the 10 studies we did apart. We didn't do great, but we found some problems and we're improving it. You could still include those in your evidence synthesis or your review process, but you're going to try to get to the point where you can do it independently to allow you to code all the studies you have. Your codebook should also be developed to align with your research question and objectives. So if you are doing a systematic map, maybe you don't even start with a codebook. You would just open coding like you would do qualitative interviews. You're saying, hey, there's this theme here, and I think this theme this theme would fall under this topic or this label, and later on you can group them. Whereas if you were trying to do a hypothesis test, you're probably going to have more fixed items. You're going to say, is there a marine protected area or not? And when it comes to coding, 2+ coders, usually 2 per study, is generally desirable, but it's not always possible. And if you do have 2+ coders, you need to consider what type of methods am I going to use for assessing consistency. Generally, one of the kappa methods is what's used, but also have mechanisms for resolving disagreements. So I think I will end it here. Again, I mentioned I'm happy to come back and discuss, even if you are interested in having a type of little collaborative workshop where we talk through some of our own projects. I'm happy to do that. But for those that want to stay or have questions, I'm good for 15, 20 minutes. If that would help anybody, it's also completely fine if there are no questions.
Yeah, I think there are some questions. So again, I'm just echoing what Graham said. If you have something else to do right now, you can leave. We're fine. But still, if you have any questions, so please go ahead and ask if Graham is here, so that we can share these answers as well with the students who are not here. Okay, so Maria has a question. Maria, please go ahead.
Hi, Graham and everyone. Thank you so much for the presentation and for sharing all of this with us. I have 2 questions. One is a little bit more broad and probably of interest to everyone. So I'll start with that one. I was wondering, Graham, if you can speak for a little bit, maybe like a couple of short answers about the advantages of conducting a literature review for graduate students. Especially, in this landscape where we are facing a lot of uncertainty with respect to data collection. And so if you could, say a couple of sentences about why conducting a literature review is an advantage for us, and maybe which one do you think is the most appropriate literature review or evidence synthesis to conduct for a graduate student who is studying in small-scale fisheries?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think one of the things, one of the reasons why both for practical purposes, like professional purposes, but also theory. So everybody is doing research and nobody's reading. There are thousands of papers like coming out all the time, and I work in the literature on the commons, and I look at like the number of papers being published. We did a synthesis using natural language processing, and there were 30 papers. Like in the 90s, 30 to 60 papers a year being published on the commons. I think that's a reasonable number. I could probably read every one of those papers and keep up to date with it. By 2018, I think I'm not sure if the date's exactly correct, but like past past 2015, we're looking at like 500 papers on the Commons. That is just simply impossible for one individual to read. But this is becoming a problem in developing knowledge. Is if we are all producing research, but we're not engaging in an exercise to synthesize that knowledge, are we really moving forward? And that's why it's super important to have people taking on the challenge as part of a big project to try and make sense of it. And it makes so much sense as part of your PhD. People told me during my PhD, like you might not feel like you have a lot of time, and I didn't either, but I had way more time than I had now to sit down and to read studies. So it is an opportunity for you to be that sense maker, to synthesize knowledge. And then the second part is professionally, is that both, citations don't matter, but they do matter a little bit. And if you want to get your name out there as someone who has, you're the small scale fisheries person, I think it makes, or the small scale fisheries team, because better to do it as a team. But you were a part of a team that made sense of a literature on small scale fisheries. I think professionally that is very desirable. That's something that's a person I'd like to hire and be part of my team, because they understand right now, when you finish that review, you will have one of the best understandings of the landscape of what small scale fisheries are and the directions that both where things are going, but also maybe where they need to go. And so you will have that competitive advantage over others that aren't undertaking an evidence synthesis project. I don't know if I fully answered. I probably missed a part of your question.
So Maria, I
No.
think you had a second question.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say yes, thank you for this insight. It's great. I was also thinking, Graham, that one of the reasons why, for example, I am doing a literature review is because when I started my PhD, there was a lot of uncertainty in terms of whether we could go in the field or not. And so a project such as a literature review, which you can do from your desk, you can do from home, it's a great alternative for in this general landscape of uncertainty. But yes, I guess it's just like a little add-on to all the great insight that you shared with us.
And that's 100%. It's even just like sometimes students are worried about, hey, like I don't have research funding to go out to the field. You don't necessarily you don't need research funding to do a pretty good, like one coder doing like a good can make significant advances in knowledge. And so yeah, I agree.
Yeah. My second question, I don't know if we have time or not, but you talk a little bit about when you were talking about coding, you suggested for scoping review to do qualitative coding or open text coding. And is that something that we can do in combination with, different types of coding? Is it more recommended for scoping and review specifically, and why?
Yeah, I feel like it's very hard to offer specific recommendations. I would say, a strong hypothesis test, your core variables should be fixed item. Like if you were testing what are the effects of marine protected areas? But that's also pretty easy. Do they have a marine protected area or not? It's pretty easy to code as a 1 or a 0. But on the other hand, would I say like, so they're doing some hypothesis testing, but they want to get some other variables. What's wrong with open coding, like of text, to provide some greater depth to their discussion? I would say absolutely nothing. I think this is partly, think about both what you're trying to achieve, what's possible, and then second is like who you are as a researcher. And so for someone like me, who tends to be geared quantitatively, Fixed item coding is desirable and something that I want to do, because I'm probably going to analyze, try and use tables and figures to summarize my major findings. But someone who is more qualitatively inclined, I see no reason why open coding is problematic. I think it's a very, very useful approach, but yeah, and a mixture is fine across different types of studies.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Any other question? We can have final couple of minutes maybe. So, okay, I had a questions. Maybe it's better if we don't go further from here on. Maybe you have other things as well, and you have been talking for a long time. It's not easy to talk for more than an hour.
Yeah, no. So I've had this. I had COVID a while back, and the cough
Yeah,
won't go away. So my voice is yeah. So, but what I would say is, like, anybody, send me an email. I'm happy to reply by email or hop on a Teams, call to discuss, because I find talking about it is really helpful. It's when we sit and we worry that we don't find solutions, because I've never found a scenario. Maybe people haven't helped me in asking them, but it's never hurt me by asking for different ideas. So yeah, I'm happy to chat.
yeah, perfect. Thank you. And maybe we were talking yesterday about the spaces that we have at the university. Maybe we can use those spaces for knowledge sharing as well sometimes during our break and things like that. Maria has a fishbowl office space. We have our island and coast. So maybe someday we will invite you in our space during your lunch break or sometime, so we can talk. And if anybody still has any question, any confusion, they can chat with you.
Sounds good.
If you have time, of course.
Of course, but yeah, I can make time. Like,
Yeah.
maybe one time I can't, but yes, I will try to make time. I don't. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much again, Graham, for your time, and thank you everyone for joining. I'm gonna stop recording now.